Ladies and gentlemen, this is GamerToday.com video. As you might be aware of, GDC 2016 is coming to a close, and it's been a very, very interesting event to say the least. However, just as we're near the closing of the ceremonies, news has emerged that several sources have been briefed by Sony that they are indeed working on a PS4.5. This upgraded system is capable of 4K games and incredible virtual reality, at least according to these sources. Well, we're going to delve into this in this very video. It's going to be fairly lengthy, so, well, sit down, basically. There is also a link in the video description which I'd encourage you to check out, because it links to several sources and reports on some of the stuff that I'm going to be discussing in this very video. For example, some of the claims regarding the current PlayStation 4's performance, some of the GPU and upcoming GPU technology, and some other bits and pieces. But for now, let's get into this. Now, it's fair to say that the current PS4 is fairly impressive, but it is reaching its limitations, particularly when it comes to virtual reality content. Currently, the system is capable just about of running most titles at 1080p, and that might sound fairly impressive, but it's absolutely piddly when you compare it to 4K, which is quite literally 4 times the amount of pixels on screen, which is a ridiculous improvement. Now, how this is going to work for existing users is a bit of a mystery, by which I mean, let's say that you're a current owner of a PS4, how will you take advantage of the PS4.5, for lack of a better official naming convention? Is it potentially possible that you're going to be opening up your system and doing some soldering? Very unlikely, let's just be honest. So it's either Sony are going to offer some trade-in program, so you would go down to your local store and say, hey, I want to upgrade to the latest model. They would take your system, give you a trade-in value, and then you would walk out with the new system. Or potentially some breakout box which would then be connected to your system with numerous connections. That's kind of unlikely. I say that because of the sheer amount of bandwidth that would be required for the system to communicate with this breakout box. The USB connections of the PS4 just do not provide enough memory bandwidth. It's just that simple. And so really, the option of a trade-in or you having to, well, basically buy from scratch is the most likely scenario. Unfortunately, we don't have any confirmation right now. So, what does this mean in reality? Well, even if you're to be ultra conservative, and by ultra conservative, we're saying so conservative it probably isn't even a reality, but let's say you're ultra conservative and you say the GPU performance of the PS4 is going to be doubled. It would mean a massive difference in levels of detail, resolution and frame rates, but it also means a bit of a head scratcher for developers, because if you were to double the PS4's GPU for one model and then have the current vanilla model as it is, how would developers get around that? Is it potentially possible that certain games are going to be relegated to the 4.5 only? Well, it's definitely possible, especially as we start going into other components. So as it is, AMD are the ones responsible for producing the APU, which is the accelerated processing unit inside the system, and this is essentially one way of saying the CPU and GPU on the same die. Now, we all know that AMD are working on the next iteration of graphics chips and CPUs. Polaris is going to be the upcoming GPU architecture, and it offers about 2.5 times performance per watt compared to the current iteration of GCN, which is the current graphics cards which are available for the PC. Now, there are a couple of notes we have to go into before we go any further. I don't want to make this ultra technical, but suffice to say that the GPU inside the PlayStation 4 is for an older version of the GCN architecture than you can currently get. The latest version for the 300 series is a couple of iterations above it. That doesn't really necessarily matter, but what it does mean is that the GPU itself, going from the current architecture to even the current released version of the desktop would provide some memory bandwidth improvements. For example, the fact that it's got better compression and other such things, which does improve performance. Polaris, however, is a completely different beast. Currently, the GPU is being produced on 28nm FinFET. This is going to be reduced to just 14. This means that quite obviously you're going to see less power consumption, you're going to be able to put more shaders, in other words more processors on the GPU, and you're just going to be able to get more performance out of it. How much? Well, we're starting to see the advent of the Polaris 11, which was supposedly running 4K video content, virtual reality video content with no cooling. It was quite literally just being passively cooled, which is rather impressive as a feat. And that is an ultra low power device. Meanwhile, the Polaris 10 has been demoed running Hitman DirectX 12 mode at 1440p at 60 FPS with absolutely no issues. And it's most likely, in fact, it's pretty damn probable, like 99% probable, that AMD were deliberately throttling the hardware to a significant degree because they just don't want to give off too much of the card's performance. However, the important part isn't necessarily what we saw in terms of the performance of the chip, but that level of performance considering that the GPU itself is absolutely minuscule. It's just the size of the Fury Nano. Now, I know you're hearing all of these things and thinking to yourself, well, how does that really relate to the PlayStation 4? Well, it means that AMD are probably going to be providing Polaris with the PS4.5. Obviously, we don't know necessarily when the system's going to launch, but it's going to be at the earliest end of this year, right? So if that's the case, it either is going to coincide with the release of the PSVR or maybe even early next year. It doesn't really make sense for AMD to release an APU or the GPU with the current state of affairs. I say all of this because this means that the GPU should theoretically offer massive performance increases, but in terms of the energy that it sucks down, they're going to be able to do so fairly cheaply. This means that it's still going to be able to operate in a fairly small enclosure. In other words, the PS4's fairly sleek design should remain intact. Following on from this, you might be tempted to say, well, what about the memory side of things? And that's really interesting. So, just to put it into perspective, the PS4 has 8GB of GDDR5 memory, and that's clocked to 5500 MHz, and that runs on a 256-bit bus. This gives the system the 176GB per second of bandwidth that we've all heard of. Now that might sound impressive, but it's actually quite low compared to the latest iteration of PC graphics cards, and the reason I'm bringing those back into the equation is quite simple. If you're running those type of resolutions, 1440p, 4K, what have you, you're going to need a ridiculous amount of bandwidth to be able to feed that. Even taking into account Tonga or the latest GTN architecture's improved color compression, it doesn't matter. They still require a lot of memory bandwidth. How much? 300GB per second plus would not surprise me. Therefore, it's likely that we're going to either see the, I guess you could say, the move to GDDR5X, or a much wider bus with GDDR5. 5X, by the way, provides twice the bandwidth per pin compared to regular 5, so that's 14 GB. Now, the other thing that makes logical sense then is if you're going to be improving the speed of the of the memory, you'll also need more of it. Currently, the PS4 has around 8GB of memory, but just 5 of that is available to games. It's actually 4.5 if you don't count what's known as the flexible memory, which is, I guess you could say, a region of memory which is controlled by the operating system on the game's behalf. By the way, a lot of what I've said in this video I'm not providing sources for or too much context because it is in the article, and I don't want to turn this into a 45-minute video because otherwise people are just going to, have their brains turned to goo. So if you do want some extra details, click on the article, and I have actually linked this stuff in there so you can do your own research, which is kind of the way forward, right? Anyway, the PS4 has about 5 gigabytes of memory, which sounds fairly okay until you realise that PS4 memory of 5 gigabytes is actually less than current GPUs have on their on the PC as an entirety. By which I mean, for example, the high-end GPUs now have at least 4 gigabytes, and that is starting to be a little under what we'd expect for 4K. And in fact, by the end of 2016, it's probable that 8 gigabyte cards are going to be really what you need to run at 4K. And that might not sound as bad, because you say, well, yeah, but, you know, what if not all games run at 4K? What if they're targeting just, let's say, 1440p, or they're targeting X? Well, yeah, but then you've got to take into account all of the game's code and everything else they're cramming in. That's why the average PC now has minimum of 8 gigabytes of memory for the actual main system, and let's say 4 or 8 gigabytes for the graphics card. And a lot of systems are going to double this up. They're going to have 16 gigabytes and maybe 8 gigabytes respectively. Therefore, it makes sense for the PS4 to do the same. It makes sense for the PS4 to, or 4.5 shall I say, to have, let's say, 16 gigabytes of GDDR5X. And they could do that, because by the time that the PS4.5 is released, theoretically, the GDDR5X chips should be produced in mass quantities, and they can get away with putting in larger DRAM chips, and they can also have a 256-bit bus. All of that simply means that they can have a fairly non-complex design. It means they don't have to have a really wide bus, which means tons of chips soldered onto the board, which means once again they can keep the space down. But further to that, they can also make sure that they keep the size of the DRAM chips up, which means they need fewer of them to give them the quantity of memory that they require, which is obviously rather important. Okay, so now we know that if the PS4.5 does exist, it needs to have a next generation GPU, which is considerably more powerful, but requires less energy than currently, because otherwise you're going to need a ridiculous amount of cooling to be able to make sure that the GPU can function. Secondly, you're going to need more memory and faster memory, which means once again GDDR5X or potentially high bandwidth memory 2 could be used, which offers ludicrous memory bandwidth up to 1 terabyte per second. However, I find it unlikely they're going to do that for a couple of reasons. One, cost is quite prohibitive, and two, DRAM chips of high quantities are going to be a bit iffy at that point. 4 gigabyte chips are going to be produced in the Q3, 8 gigabyte chips are going to be produced in the next quarter, but are they really going to want to do that when they're so expensive? They've got to worry about the interposer, which is essentially the connection between the DRAM chips and the APU. It's very unlikely, therefore I think they're going to stick with more traditional memory for this instance, because it's cheaper, it's easy to find, and it just, they don't need HBM2, let's just say that. Now, what about the CPU? So, to give you a bit of background, currently the PS4's CPU is exactly the same as Xbox One. The difference is in the clock speed. The PS4 AMD Jaguars run at 1.6 GHz compared to the Xbox One's 1.75. These numbers have been confirmed. And the Jaguars are low power processors. There are 8 of them. 6 of them are available to game code. The seventh CPU core can be used in certain instances if the OS does not use it. That's very much like the Xbox One's 7th CPU core as well. For example, with the Xbox One, if Kinect needed to use it, then it would be unavailable, or a portion of it would be unavailable for the game. Therefore, the game needed to be created with that percentage, I guess you could say, flexible. If you just heard a whole bunch of words and still wondering, well, how does that relate to the PC? Fairly poorly. The CPU inside both consoles, in terms of per core performance, is not that great. Compared to that of a desktop or even a high-end laptop, the CPU is just kind of slow. And we've seen various benchmarks with this. We've seen various evidence that has popped up and shown that the system is just not capable of high performance compared to, once again, a desktop. The reason I bring this up is quite important, and that is quite simply that if you're going to improve the GPU, let's say you're going to double it or treble it or quadruple it in terms of performance, which is more than possible with the Polaris, Polaris architecture, you're going to need a better CPU. How much faster? Probably considerably faster. And there are certainly APUs, new APUs from AMD, which could do this. It could even be a derivative of Zen, which is the upcoming architecture, which is actually multi-threaded. So theoretically, one CPU, well, not even theoretically, in reality, one AMD Zen core is capable of running 2 simultaneous threads. But unfortunately, we don't know too much at the moment. It's probable it could be some form of APU. It's very doubtful that Sony or AMD want to split them up because of various benefits in terms of heat and that type of stuff. So they're probably going to keep them as an APU rather than a separate CPU and GPU. Plans for an upgraded system are not new. Sony are not the only ones who have talked about this. Phil Spencer mentioned it regarding the Xbox One, but then he backtracked fairly quickly and said, am I going to be opening up my console and start upgrading the individual pieces? That's not our plan. But he had seemed rather keen on the idea previously. So it's probable that they are also thinking much the same. And yes, you've got Nintendo NX, which is on its way. We know that Nintendo are very, very secretive regarding the system specifications, and I've heard everything from the system is going to be roughly on par to that of the Xbox One/PS4 between the two, all the way to it's comparable to a very high-spec PC when it's running games. Your guess is as good as mine, because it's like, that is a massive gulf, that's a massive disparity between the two. Your guess is as good as mine of which one it's going to fall under, but even if you said Nintendo did not exist, let's say the NX was 15 months away, 2 years away, 16 years away, it's irrelevant. There is one thing that neither company can discount, and that is the shift towards PC. And one of the reasons behind that is quite simple. PC hardware, in terms of the performance you get, performance per dollar, is getting a lot better. And with high-resolution displays starting to come out, with the shift towards those displays, for example 4K, with high-speed refresh rates, for example 120Hz, with virtual reality, and with God knows what else coming out over the next several months, and developers really wanting more performance out of the system, developers have already started to complain that the 4.5/5 gigabytes of memory available on the PS4 is just not enough. And they just want more memory. Same thing with the CPU, where they're already having to do a lot of optimization. And it's not to say that the current systems suck, it's just to say that in a couple of years from now, they're definitely going to start hitting that wall. They're going to start hitting the, well, gee, there's not much more I can do to get better performance out of the system. And to be fair, the PS4 and the Xbox One started out pretty strongly. I mean, look at Rise. Look at Killzone Shadowfall. Look at the infamous Second Son or The Order. They look amazing. Seriously, they look beautiful. But we're still getting those complaints of, well, they're not running at 60 FPS. So you're still getting those, well, it's slowing down and other complaints. And it's going to continue. So am I all for the idea of an upgradable or an upgraded PS4.5? Yeah, sure. Assuming it's done correctly, and assuming Sony don't gouge us, like let's say they release it at like $900, I'm sure that people are going to complain. But with the dropping price of the PS4 already, by the time they do get to release the system, it's probable they might do it for around the same price of the launch PS4, maybe slightly higher. This is particularly true if you've got a system already and you can trade it in, which I think would be fairly reasonable. So, let me know your thoughts and opinions on this one. There's a lot more I could say on it, but the video's already getting fairly lengthy, to be honest with you. And because news is not exactly super duper thick on the ground at the moment, we can only go by what these developers have stated. There is definitely a lot of rumouring and murmuring in Camp Sony, and it's fairly obvious that the number of sources who Kotaku are saying that they're speaking to trusted sources. These are not just, some random dude who happened to be near them at the drinks fountain and said, yeah, I know, Joe Bob who's working, as a janitor, and Joe Bob as a janitor also know his cousin, John, and John happens to know, the CEO of, Sony, and they've spoken. No, these are actually pretty reputable reports, and obviously they can't say, well, this guy from Epic or this guy from X knows this because of obvious problems in the industry. You're going to get blacklisted. But the reports are coming in, and I would not be surprised if this come to a basically I wouldn't be surprised if something came of this. And the idea of Sony really pushing towards a virtual reality market, I mean, let's face it, look at the PS4 VR solutions. They're not just taking this as kind of like, yeah, by the way, here's a VR solution and we're just doing this because we want to. They really believe in the product. And yes, you can argue that the PS4's VR solution is impressive, but ultimately to drive those experiences you need an awful lot of performance. You need a hefty dosage of GPU performance. We know that the PS4's VR solution doesn't offer that at the moment. PSVR has an external box, and it does process some audio, and it does a few bits here and there, but it doesn't actually add extra pixels to the image. So really, the PS4 is the thing that's doing most of the grunt work. So Sony definitely want the PlayStation to match up to the Oculus. They want it to match up to the HTC Vive. And it's potentially possible, given, once again, a more powerful set of hardware, that it could do that. So let me know your thoughts and opinions on this one. Would you be willing to cough up? Would you buy an upgraded PlayStation 4? Or would you just stick with what you've got? And would you be pissed if only certain games could run on the 4.5 and you would be left in the cold if you own the vanilla system? I think some people would. Let me know your thoughts on this one. Anyway, as usual, if you want to like, share and subscribe, I would be very grateful indeed. But for now, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.